Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday and time for gas. And you do know it's a two for Tuesday because we're going to do the morning gas. And then at 6 p.m. tonight, a special edition of gas on Zoom. And that's right. You can get into the Zoom meeting if you'd like. The link is posted on my Facebook page. Just look for the introduction of today's events, and you'll see the link there. You click on that. About 5:45 or so, I'll start getting things set up, and you can join us live at that point in time. Good morning, Bobby Z and Jay Black. Welcome to the Morning Gas. One of my favorite car companies that unfortunately is no longer around was Studebaker. Now, my partiality for cars kind of dates back to my days growing up with my dad. The first car I remember him having was actually a Nash. It was a big Nash, four-door. The seats folded down, and we could go to the drive-in and kind of just hang out together because it was like a big bed. But his next car was a 1951 Studebaker bullet nose four-door with suicide rear doors, and that car left a distinct impression on me. Now, I've never had the opportunity to own one of those, but I did own a 48, and I kind of liked that car. Unfortunately, as with other cars, it went away and someone else is driving it, but it was a neat old car. Studebakers have always been part of my family's life. My cousins, my uncles, a bunch of them were into Studebakers quite a bit, and I can remember with my cousin Michael, we would deliver for his dad's butcher shop. We did deliveries for them, and we did it in his Studebaker President four-door. We cruised all over with that car. Now, Gramps, I called him Gramps. He was actually a cousin that raised my father in the early days. He and Graham had a Studebaker Speedster. Here's a couple of retired people, and you'd think they'd have a nice boxy four-door sedan, but not them. Good morning there. Hi, Ron. How you doing? But they had a Speedster. Now, this was a top-of-the-line two-door coupe from Studebaker in the early 1950s. 289, very aerodynamic. You're right, Jay. Many of them have found their way onto the Bonneville Salt Flats and El Mirage and other places because they had slick styling. But the history of that slick styling is really a history of just improving upon an older design. Now, the Studebaker Manufacturing Company came to be in 1852. That's right, 1852. Now, they didn't make cars, but they made some of the best horse-drawn wagons in the world. As a matter of fact, they got so big, they were shipping their product all over the world. And presidents such as Abraham Lincoln rode in a Studebaker wagon. Now, this was the quality of the four Studebaker brothers. They got together, they built their legacies with wagons. But in the early 1900s, they decided it was time to get into the automotive business. Hi, Amber Elizabeth. You're going to join us tonight, I hope. She's one of the girls of Irwindale, and she's one of the top racers out there. Of course, she did have a slight problem. We'll go into that on the show tonight, but we'll talk about that. Hi, Pete. How you doing? Pete Muriello, a funny car driver, joining us right now. All right, so the brothers, there were four of them, and they were, well, let's see, Peter, Jacob, Clem, Henry, and John. Wait a minute, that's five. Peter, Jacob, Clem, Henry, John. Yeah, there was five brothers. They all worked together well. As a matter of fact, if you ever get to see a picture of them, it seemed like they were in a beard growing contest too, because they all had these long, bushy beards, kind of like Johnny Martinez. But they had it before Johnny was even thought of. I mean, it goes back. But the Studebaker family migrated to the United States in the 1700s. They were a well-established family here, starting out in Philadelphia, going to Maryland, and then finally setting up their manufacturing in Indiana. And in Indiana, they became the major employer of people in their home state. Now, they started building wagons, as I said, and in the early 1900s, they moved to cars. Now, they made the transition and did quite well. But by the late 1950s, early 1960s, General Motors had 50% of the U.S. car market. Studebaker, only 4%. Not enough to really keep them solvent. They went through a number of operators, I guess you could say, because I never thought their presidents, when the brothers relinquished power, really cared about keeping the company going. It was more of a power struggle. And the five brothers all died before 1917. John Mueller was the last one to die, but the sons and son-in-laws remain active in management, but most notably Fred Fish, after his marriage to John M.'s daughter in 1891. Colonel George Studebaker, Clement Studebaker, and J.M. Studebaker Jr., and Frederick Studebaker Fish served apprenticeships in different departments of the company and rose to important official roles, but never ascending to the presidency of the company. Mr. Erskine adds son-in-laws and Nelson, Riley, and Charles to the group. But the Studebaker company never really took off. They were a powerhouse. They made some amazing automobiles with advantages and advancements that many companies didn't go to at the same time. They were ahead of the game. They were always behind the eight ball. Not being one of the leading companies, they had to react to the market instead of set the market pace. Although their aerodynamic styling was way ahead of its time, it did not necessarily go over well with buyers, much like Chrysler found when they introduced the airflow. Now, if you look at the lineage of the Studebaker cars, the 1953, which is considered the start of the aerodynamic Studebakers, really didn't change much from its predecessors. As a matter of fact, some of the body parts were even the same. They just changed the fenders, lowered the body a little bit, but utilized a lot of components from previous model Studebakers. Now, Studebaker was one of the early companies to come up with an overhead valve V8 as a regular production option, and did so, and that engine continued on. It became a 289 and was very powerful. As a matter of fact, Andy Granatelli took Studebakers to Bonneville. They took the Lark, which had a performance version called the Daytona, before Chrysler did. They took the Avante to the dry lake beds or the salt flats, and with a host of drivers, including a lady driver, Paula Murphy, set numerous world endurance and speed records for production vehicles. So the Studebaker was definitely a top car. So it was good. They were reliable. They were solid. Now, unfortunately, for financial reasons, they merged with Packard. And that signaled the death blow for Studebaker. Packard was floundering as well. From being one of the premier luxury cars in the business, they lost favor and merged with Studebaker. When they did, and depending on what you read, Studebaker merged with them or they merged with Studebaker, the Packard vehicles as we knew them at those times disappeared. And one of the reasons I read in a book on Studebakers was the Packards were too big to fit down the assembly line for the Studebakers. So what they ended up doing was taking a Studebaker, making a long, sleek Packard nose for the front of a Studebaker Hawk. Now, they put the Packard V8 engine in, which was massive in compared to the Studebaker, making the car very front heavy. Hi, Kelly Barr Anderson. How are you doing this morning? And yes, I will check your post in just a little bit as soon as we're done here. All right, EMF was out there too, and this was a manufacturing plant in Wickersville, Ontario, Canada. Studebaker bought that, started building cars in Canada. As a matter of fact, the last Studebakers made were made in Canada. The plant in Indiana closed down, but it's not totally gone. They put a 3-mile endurance oval out there in the middle of nowhere at the time in Indiana, and it was used for testing vehicles. It had rub strips, it had cobblestones, it had, you name it, any type of hazard or something that would test the stability and the reliability of a vehicle was out there. Now, the track still remains, and Navistar, which was International Harvester, uses that track today with their trucks. So it was so advanced and so well built, it is still functioning today. Now, Studebaker had if you get an overhead shot of that facility, you would have seen they planted trees and trimmed them to write out the name Studebaker. And I'm not talking about little bitty trees. These were huge trees, and they were almost as big as the oval itself. Now, over time, obviously, no one's trimming them, and there's no reason because Studebaker no longer exists. Now, one of the cars that Studebaker came out with, the Avante, was very revolutionary for its time. It was a fiberglass-bodied sports coupe, I guess you could say. It sat 4 people. Now, the only other major manufacturer to produce a fiberglass car was Chevrolet, and it was a Corvette. It was a 2-seat sports car. The Avante fared very well as far as the press previews. It was an exciting-looking vehicle, and it sat 4 people. 289 supercharged option, 4-speed. It was a great machine. Tom Jan saying his dad bought a 1948 Stud Coupe, ugly green. His brother and he would not ride in it because it was so ugly. I had a 48. It was a 2-tone blue. And the thing that struck me about that car is Studebaker had what they call a freewheeling device. It was an electric solenoid that would actually release the clutch when you let off the throttle. So instead of downshifting to slow down, you lifted your throttle, you had no clutch, your car just freewheeled, it coasted. Now in California, technically, freewheeling, as they call it, is somewhat illegal. It's used for getting better fuel mileage, and Studebakers were known for their excellent fuel mileage, even when performance was the issue, not fuel consumption. Now, the car I had was a 6-cylinder flathead inline, and it had more than enough power for me. It was fun to drive. It had a 3-speed overdrive with the freewheeling option, and it was a great car. It was a Starlight Coupe. The rear window, multiple pieces, wrapped around almost like the front windshield of an airplane at the time. And it was a neat-looking car. My kids at the time liked to drive in it because it was just fun being in this old car because it had that unique odor of an old car. Well, Studebaker Marquis was established in 1910 when they decided to refinance and incorporate as Studebaker Corporation. So there in 1914, and they were under New Jersey laws at the time. The financing was handled by Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs. Sound familiar? Those guys are still around. And the board approved them. Now, they left the EMF facilities that they had purchased and moved to Indiana. The corporation benefited from enormous orders cabled by the British government at the outbreak of World War I. So they were a war supply company in World War I, and what they provided was wagons. Not cars, but wagons. They sold 20,000 sets of artillery harnesses, 60,000 artillery saddles, an ambulance, as well as hundreds of cars, including 3,000 transport wagons. In 1913, their 6-cylinder models, well, they employed important advancements. A monoblock engine, basically a casting that was associated with production economy of the time, and that engine lasted for quite a few years. A 28-year-old university graduate, Fred Zender, was appointed chief engineer, and he was first of a trio of brilliant technicians that Studebaker used to launch successful 1918 model cars. And those guys were known inside the company as the Three Musketeers. They left in 1920 to form a consultancy agency, and it became part of Chrysler Engineering. And if you think about it, 1920, Chrysler Engineering, they were building the Model T Ford. Interesting. All right, the horse-drawn buggy started to go away, and the cars started taking over. By 1918, Studebaker plants were producing about 100,000 automobiles, 75,000 horse-drawn vehicles, and about $10 million worth of automobile and spare parts for horses, drawn buggies, and such. Denny Sanders is a guy in SoCal named Gordon Williams, ran a supercharged Lark in NHRA stock eliminator in the 60s. It was pretty competitive, and yes, they were, because you got to remember, Studebaker downsized their whole line of cars in the early 1960s. The Lark was actually considered a compact at the time and was about the same size as a Chevy, too. The 289 with the supercharger, lightweight unibody car, was very quick for the time. And one of my bucket list cars actually was a Studebaker Daytona Coupe with the 289. Supercharged would have been nice, but had to have a 4-speed. It was a very sporty car for the time. And if you look at the roof line of the Larks, same as the 1953 Studebaker. All they did was basically change the fenders and doors. The roof line, the windshield, the rear window, they were all carried over from 1953. Now, they built the proving ground I talked about earlier in 1925. The Depression really had massive effects on Studebaker, and they laid off quite a few people. In the 20s, Studebaker had 225 acres spread over 3 locations, and they were producing 180,000 cars. They had 23,000 people employed, all in South Bend, Indiana. So they were the major employer in Indiana. Now, there's a museum there in Indiana to commemorate the Studebaker and all the cars they produced. And one of the cars I did own, besides my Studebaker Coupe, was a Rockney. Now, Newt Rockney, the Notre Dame coach, worked part-time for Studebaker. Now, the reason being is, unlike today where the coaches stay on all year long with their schools, Notre Dame's football program was seasonal. And with that, Newt Rockney's job was seasonal, and Newt was the head coach. You know him. You've heard about him. If you're interested in football at all, you know Newt Rockney was one heck of a coach. But during the off-season, he needed to make money. He worked his way into Studebaker and became a sales manager for the corporation itself. He was so well liked and so well respected that Studebaker decided to make a car with his name on it. Now, at that point in time, Studebaker cars were rather large. They didn't compete against Ford and Chevrolet. They were more towards the Oldsmobile Pontiacs. They wanted an entry-level car, a car that would compete head-to-head with Ford and Chevrolet. The idea was a small Studebaker. Now, small for the time. So they came out with the Rockney. The Rockney was a car about the same size as a Ford, with many styling cues that Ford picked up later on. And I had a 1932 Rockney. The fenders had side skirting like a 34 Ford. Ford didn't have that yet. They had a cover over the gas tank mounted in the rear behind the bumper. Ford really didn't have that. They actually made the tank the shape of the cover, and the tank was the cover, so it was exposed. Rockney's dashboard was flowing, much like an Auburn Speedster at the time, and it was beautifully done. It had what looked like almost a chop top. The roof line was a little bit lower. It had very long nose and a 6-cylinder engine to compete against Ford and try and keep up with Chevrolet. It had the horsepower to do that. It had 4 leaf springs, one at each corner of the car. The frame was so rigid, you could take one wheel off and the car would stay level. That's how stiffly sprung or stiff the chassis was. It didn't flex much. It had a cross member, an X member in the middle, and it was a very strong chassis. Now, when I was doing it, I wasn't worried about authenticity or keeping it stock. I loved the body style. That stayed stock, but we put an independent front suspension in it, 4 to 8-inch rear end in the rear, and it was powered by a late model Buick V6 at the time, which in the early 1980s was a pretty popular engine for hot rods, and it was enough to get that car moving pretty well. I built the car, and it went away. I sold it to get my Plymouth Coupe that I've got today, and it's been over 35 years since I had that Rockney, but there were so many styling cues on that Rockney. It was an amazing looking car. The problem with the Rockney is Newt Rockney. Unfortunately, he was in a plane crash shortly after the car was introduced, and that put a sour note on the introduction of the Rockney. It only lasted for 2 or 3 years in production, but it was a beautiful car. I've seen a couple of them made into hot rods as well. Haven't seen mine, but hey, it's out there someplace. Someone's got it. So Studebaker stayed in business until the early to mid 1960s. They closed the plant in Indiana. Many, many people had worked there their whole life. It was the main employer for that city in South Bend, Indiana. They started producing vehicles out of Canada. Well, they didn't start, they continued until their demise in 1966, when Studebaker closed their doors forever. Studebaker left a legacy that lasted for many, many years. The Avante found life numerous times under different owners, and the Avante name and the basic body shape stayed in production through the 1980s. Unfortunately, it didn't have the draw necessary to keep it going. Although the Studebaker Drivers Club is very strong, you'll find that the average owner of a Studebaker is, like me, kind of ancient, because we're the ones that remember those cars. The younger people don't even know what a Studebaker was or is. So the lifespan of a Studebaker, well, they're still out there. Their trucks were more stylish than Chevrolet and Ford. Their cars were really well built and solid, but they didn't last as a company. The cars are still on the road today. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas, the morning edition, talking about Studebakers. Don't forget, tonight, we're going to be on, again, Zoom meeting type. We can't go in studio anymore for the evening show, so what we've done is we've set up a show on Zoom video. You can join in. The link is posted on my page. We're going to have a great show tonight. Rodney Allen Rippey. We're going to have Bill Montgomery, the girls from Irwindale, and more this evening. And we'll talk to them, and you can too. So think about it for a second and check it out. Now, Phil Hoffman says, hey, I'm thinking about a 1939 International short bed. Nice truck. I had a 1935. I liked it. It's a very solid truck. Jim DeFrank is watching. Hey, Jim, how are you doing this morning? Thanks for tuning in to GAAS, the Great American Auto Scene. Since 1990, your source for automotive information, a little bit of humor, and trivia. Have a great day. We'll see you tonight at 6 p.m. on Zoom when we interview Rodney Allen Rippey. He's a car guy. You might remember him from the Jack in the Box Jumbo Jack days. Bill Mitchell, or Bill Montgomery, he puts on a great program to motivate kids, getting them into the automotive trades. And the girls from Irwindale, Drag Strip, and Speedway. Cheryl Highland, Kelly Barr Anderson, Amber Elizabeth, and more. Candy Larson. We may have a whole bunch of ladies that race at Irwindale. And with their own cars, too. We'll talk to you later. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas, the morning edition. Have a great day.